The last voicemail they got from me was the one they finally listened to. If you're hearing this, I'm gone. Or at least, gone enough that I can't explain myself in person. So here's what you're going to do. Not for me. For you. I heard nothing for 3 years before that. Not a birthday call. Not a visit on Father's Day. My son, David, was too busy growing his tech company. My daughter, Elise, sent yearly Christmas cards with pre-printed signatures and glossy photos of people I didn't recognize anymore. And yet, the moment my attorney reached out about the video, suddenly they were everywhere. Calling. Texting. Crying into voicemails. Acting like time hadn't rusted the line between us down to a silent wire. They wanted to know what I'd left them. They assumed it was money. The house. The cabin by the lake. Maybe even my coin collection, the one David mocked me for years ago, hoarding pocket change like it's treasure, he'd said. But I didn't leave them a will. I left them instructions. A series of letters. A sequence of locations. Tasks that wouldn't make sense all at once, but would feel familiar, if they remembered me at all. Drive to the old gas station on Route 8. Ask for Tom. He'll hand you a key. Return to the treehouse behind your mother's first apartment. There's something carved into the floorboards. Find it. Visit the community center. Volunteer for 1 day. I didn't say what came next. They'd have to find it. Follow it. If they wanted anything from me, they'd have to walk back through the trail of who I was, not the caricature they created once they left. The real me. The man who once carried their scraped knees and science projects and late-night fears. The man they buried long before I ever stopped breathing. What they didn't know, what no one did, was that I wasn't gone. Not yet. Not fully. But they needed to believe I was. Only then would they listen. And only then could they begin to remember. I wasn't born sentimental. I became that way after their mother left. Caroline was sunshine with sharp edges. Beautiful, brilliant, and always half a step away from somewhere else. When she walked out, the kids were 9 and 7. She left a note and a closet half full. David didn't cry. Elise did, for both of them. I raised them alone after that. We moved in with my father for a while, then into a rental with peeling paint and a backyard full of weeds that became a soccer field by summer's end. I fixed what I could. Worked overtime to pay for what I couldn't. I was the coach, the nurse, the parent-teacher conference warrior. I burned casseroles and learned to braid hair. I didn't always get it right, but I showed up. Always. We built routines. Sunday pancakes. Bedtime stories from books I barely had energy to finish. I once drove 4 hours back from a job site because Elise forgot her flute on concert day. David failed his math test in 5th grade, and I sat with him every night for weeks until the numbers stopped floating. They were good kids. Curious. Kind. Until they weren't. I'm not sure when it changed. Maybe after high school. Maybe after I stopped being the man they needed and became the man they tolerated. David stopped visiting first. Always a new excuse. Work. Traffic. The world moving too fast. Elise moved to Oregon and called less every year. Then came the distance. Subtle at first. Fewer thank yous. More interruptions. They stopped asking how I was, only if I needed anything, like it was a favor. Like I was a plant left behind that needed watering once a month. I retired early. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I joined a walking group. Taught local kids about coin collecting at the library. I left messages for David on his birthday. Wrote Elise handwritten letters she never mentioned receiving. Then came the diagnosis. Not fatal. Not immediately. But enough. Enough to make me consider how I'd be remembered. Not for the effort. Not for the scraped knees or the bedtime stories. But for what I left behind. And so, I made a decision. If they wanted to remember me, really remember me, they'd have to walk the road I once walked. Not with guilt. With effort. Because memory is not a gift. It's a task. The final time I invited them over, it was Elise who cancelled first. "I've got a workshop in Seattle that weekend," she said, as though I were asking her to skip a meeting instead of share a meal. David didn't respond at all. When I followed up, he replied a day later, "Can we Zoom instead?" Zoom. For the man who'd once stayed up 3 nights straight tending his fever. For the man who gave up his own savings so they could finish school without debt. For the man who sat in empty bleachers during rainy soccer games so someone would be cheering. But I said yes. I always said yes. They called late, pixelated and distracted. Elise logged in from her car. David muted to take a call halfway through. I tried to tell them about the community garden project I'd started. They smiled politely. They didn't ask questions. Didn't remember the garden used to be their mother's favorite place. Didn't ask why I looked thinner. Pale. I ended the call early. Said I had a book to finish. They didn't protest. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where I kept their old birthday cards. Construction paper ones with misspelled words and hand-drawn hearts. I ran my thumb over the crayon lines and thought, what happened to these kids? I didn't lose my children in a single moment. I lost them in the absence of small ones. They stopped asking, then they stopped noticing, then they stopped calling. And still, I kept loving. That's what made it betrayal. Not the silence. Not the distance. But the knowing. That they knew I was still here, and decided that wasn't enough reason to stay connected. When I fell in the garage, it was the neighbor who called the ambulance. Not Elise. Not David. They didn't even know until 3 days later, when the hospital called the emergency contact list. Elise texted, "Are you okay?" I replied, "Yes." And that was the last thing I sent them. Not because I didn't want to write more. But because they never wrote back. After the fall, I sat in a hospital bed staring at the speckled ceiling tiles, counting them over and over like they could tell me something I didn't already know. I wasn't in pain, at least, not in the way the nurses thought. The fracture in my wrist would heal. The bruised ribs would fade. What hurt was deeper. Older. It was the kind of ache that accumulates from being unseen for too long. They kept asking who would pick me up when I was discharged. I kept saying I'd call someone. I didn't. I went home in a cab. Tipped too much so I wouldn't have to talk. The house was dark when I stepped inside. Still. Dust had started to collect in corners I used to keep spotless. Even the clock seemed to tick with less purpose. I sat on the edge of the bed with one shoe still on, staring at the empty space on the nightstand where Caroline used to keep her glasses. I whispered, "You'd know what to do." But there was no answer. The next few days blurred. I didn't eat much. I didn't shave. I watched the same 3 movies on repeat just to hear voices that weren't mine. The mail piled up. The garden grew wild. I wasn't grieving a person, I was grieving a place. The place I used to have in their lives. A role that used to matter. I started writing letters I didn't send. To David. To Elise. To Caroline. Letters full of half-finished thoughts and small memories, Elise's first drawing. David's obsession with space. The day we painted the hallway together and got more on ourselves than the wall. I kept them in a shoebox under the bed. And then one day, I wrote something different. It was a note to myself: if they don't remember who you were, remind them. Make them walk the road back. That's when the idea started. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just, clarity. If I couldn't be their father in life, maybe I could be something else in absence. A guide. A voice. A map. So I began to build it. The letters. The recordings. The trail. Not to hurt them. But to offer them a chance, one last chance, to choose to come home. Not to the house. To the man who had never truly left. It began with a list. Not a bucket list. Not a revenge plot. Not regrets. A blueprint. I sat at the old kitchen table, carved initials still faint in one corner, a coffee stain shaped like a crescent moon, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. The pen in my hand shook, not from age, but from memory. I wasn't drafting a legacy. I was mapping a path backward, through time, through place, through love unremembered. Each line I wrote was deliberate. Go to the old hardware store in Millbrook. Ask for George. Tell him what broke and why. Return to your mother's first apartment. The treehouse is still behind it. Find what's carved into the floorboards. Visit the community center on 4th Street. Volunteer 1 full day. Don't talk about it. Just do it. These weren't errands. They were echoes. Fragments of the father they once had, the man they'd lost long before I left them anything material. The idea came in fragments too. During those long, empty nights after the fall, when silence pressed against the walls like another occupant. I'd get flashes, David laughing, mud on his shoes. Elise asleep under a pile of library books. Caroline in the garden, humming with a pencil behind her ear. They didn't remember those versions of themselves. But I did. And I wanted to remind them, not through stories, but through steps. Through small pilgrimages back into places that once held us all together. Then came the letters. Not goodbye letters. Not guilt trips. Just truths. To David, you stopped calling me when you didn't know what to say. But son, you don't build connection with perfect words. You build it by showing up, even awkward, even late. To Elise, you moved across the country and called it independence. I called it distance. And I never resented you for leaving. I only missed hearing you laugh. Some letters were stories. Some were questions. Some were just memories I didn't want to die with. And then there were the recordings. I borrowed a camcorder from the library. No special effects. No edits. Just me. A man at his kitchen table, speaking into silence with the hope that it would one day become presence. In one, I said, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. Or you think I am. And that's fine. Because maybe you needed the silence to hear me again. I didn't make them watch everything in order. That wasn't the point. I just needed them to keep going, to let curiosity guide them, not greed. I left flash drives and lockboxes. Handed keys to people they hadn't seen since childhood. Each one a thread, quietly waiting to be pulled. Then I spoke to my lawyer. Not about estate plans, but about timing. I didn't want this to unfold with death. I wanted it to begin when I disappeared just enough to be missed, but not enough to be mourned. I'm not dead, I told him. But I'm done waiting. He understood. We agreed on the date. On the method. On the delivery. After that, I packed a small bag. One change of clothes. My favorite paperback. A photo of the kids when they were still children. I left the house with the porch light on, and drove to a cabin 2 counties over. Borrowed from a friend who owed me nothing but trusted me anyway. There, I waited. Not for them to come find me. For them to find themselves. The turning point wasn't the planning, or the writing, or even the leaving. It was the realization that I could still be their father. Not by being present. But by being remembered. This wasn't revenge in the way most people think of it. There was no anger left in me. No rage. Only the kind of sorrow that becomes resolve. What I did next was simple. Precise. Almost gentle. But it was still a form of justice. I started with memory. I placed objects in their path, things they'd forgotten. Elise received a small, battered matchbox from a motel we stayed at during a road trip when she was 12. David found one of his childhood drawings, carefully folded and left under the back seat of his car by someone I'd trusted to plant it. Each task in the letters wasn't just a direction, it was a door. Each stop was part of the world they abandoned when they outgrew needing a father. I didn't force reflection. I simply placed it where they had to step around it or trip over it. Open the drawer in the hallway table. Read the note inside. Then leave it there for someone else. Spend an hour sitting by the lake. No phone. Just memory. Help someone today. Don't mention me. These were not punishments. They were reminders wrapped in quiet discipline. The trail led them backward, not to me, but to themselves. To the children they used to be. To the lives I tried to build for them with calloused hands and soft-spoken lessons. They moved forward slowly. David struggled more. He questioned the purpose. Sent frustrated texts to my lawyer, demanding clarity. He didn't get it. He wasn't supposed to. Elise leaned in. She cried after the fourth task, planting marigolds in a community garden we once built in her mother's name. She stayed 2 extra hours and didn't mention it to anyone. I knew all this not because I watched, but because I left people in their path who could feel it. Witnesses, not informants. Friends from the past. Strangers with kind eyes. Each one asked to hand over a note or hold a silence when it mattered. I lived quietly during that time. A small cabin with a wood stove and windows that opened onto fog. I chopped firewood. Read old letters. Fed the neighbor's cat. And I didn't wonder what they were doing. Because the work wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs. The letters changed tone as they moved deeper. The stories got more vulnerable. I told them things I never could in life. About fear. About loneliness. About how proud I'd been even when I felt forgotten. But I also told them what it meant to walk away from someone who kept showing up, and what it costs to come back once the door has closed. They began writing back. Not directly, just entries in the notebooks I'd left at certain locations. Reflections. Fragments. I recognized their handwriting and their hesitation. David's script started rigid, skeptical. By the 7th note, it had softened. Elisa's words were more fluid, but broken by silence. At one stop, she simply wrote, "I remember now." That was enough. This wasn't revenge. It was a slow unraveling of what they believed about me, and a reconstruction of what I had always been. No anger. No threats. Just a path. Lined with grace, and a little grief. And like all meaningful paths, it led somewhere. Not to a fortune. Not even to forgiveness. But to understanding. And that, I had learned, was the rarest inheritance of all. The silence that followed was different than before. This time, it hummed with weight. David missed a crucial investor meeting because he detoured to visit the cabin by the lake. A partner called it a pattern of emotional unpredictability. His company's board began whispering about leadership changes. Elise, meanwhile, found herself returning to places from her childhood. Not for the tasks anymore, but because something in them made her feel more grounded than anything else in her curated life. Her social media followers noticed. She began posting less. Writing more. They started calling each other. At first, just to ask, "Did you do this part yet?" But eventually, to say, "I didn't remember that, until now." And then, "Do you think he knew what this would do to us?" They were reconnecting not just with me, but with each other, siblings who'd grown distant beneath the layers of adulthood and self-importance. They remembered inside jokes. Recalled stories they thought they'd forgotten. Found themselves crying for reasons they couldn't explain. David asked my lawyer if there was more. He was told, there's only what he left behind. So he went back. Reread the letters. Rewatched the videos. He cried. Elise found the old rocking chair from her mother's garden set, hidden behind a tarp in the garage. She refinished it by hand. Said nothing to anyone about it. Just left it on her own front porch. People noticed the change. Their friends. Their colleagues. Even strangers. David's assistant told him he seemed less tense. Elisa's neighbor said she smiled like someone who finally knew what she missed. And through it all, I stayed quiet. Not out of vengeance. Out of trust. I had planted the seeds. And now, the garden was beginning to grow, without needing to see the gardener. They were learning that love doesn't always come wrapped in warmth. Sometimes it comes in quiet lessons. In trails that lead you to the mirror. In truths that unfold slowly. And yes, in consequences that aren't punishments, but invitations to change. They had wanted an inheritance. What they received was accountability. And for the first time in years, they didn't run from it. They walked toward it. Together. It wasn't dramatic. No angry confrontations or raised voices. Just a quiet Sunday afternoon, sun cutting through the cabin window, when I heard a knock. I didn't move right away. I let it come again, a second knock, softer this time, hesitant. When I opened the door, Elise stood there. She looked older. Not in years, but in weight. Her eyes held something I hadn't seen in a long time, humility. Behind her, David climbed out of the car. His walk slower than I remembered. Shoulders hunched, not with shame, but with effort. I wasn't sure you'd be here, Elise said. I wasn't sure you'd come, I replied. We stood for a moment. The silence between us wasn't strained, it was reverent. Can we come in? David asked. I stepped aside. They sat on the old couch like kids again. Elise ran her fingers along the stitching. David looked at the fireplace, as if remembering something he couldn't place. I don't know what to say, he finally said. Then don't, I said. Just sit. So we did. For what felt like hours. Eventually, Elise pulled out a small notebook. I wrote things down, she said. Things I forgot. Things I remembered. She handed it to me, then withdrew her hand like it was too fragile to finish the gesture. David leaned forward. I missed things. Not just memories. I missed the chance to know you as a man, not just a father. I missed being known, I said. We didn't cry. Not then. But something passed between us, recognition. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something smaller and more powerful, understanding. They didn't ask about the will. They didn't ask what they would get. They asked if I was staying. I don't know, I said. Maybe I already left the part of me you needed. David nodded. Maybe we had to lose you to find you. We shared tea. Told stories. Laughed, even. When they left, they hugged me, not tightly, not formally. Gently. And when the door closed behind them, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt seen. The cabin felt different after they left. Not emptier. Just quieter. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache. The kind that breathes. I made tea that evening. Lit a small candle. Sat by the window and watched the wind stir the trees. No expectations. No dread. Just presence. For the first time in years, I felt still. Days passed. Then weeks. I received no follow-ups. No dramatic gestures. Just a postcard from Elise, a photo of the lake with a single sentence, "Thank you for the path." David sent a package. Inside, his old science medal I'd framed for him in high school. A note read, "I kept this. I want you to know it meant something." I put it on the mantel. The garden at the cabin began to grow again. I planted tomatoes, basil, watched the bees return to the lavender. I waved to neighbors, taught a boy down the road how to fix a leaky faucet. Nothing big. Just enough. The ache in my chest wasn't gone, but it had softened. Memory had replaced longing. I began journaling again, not to record grief, but gratitude. I listed the moments. The quiet winds. Warm bread on a rainy morning. The sound of wind in pine needles. My children finding their way back to themselves, and, in some way, to me. One night, I wrote a final letter. Not to be mailed. Not to be read. Just to exist. It began, "I have lived well." Not loudly. But honestly. When I folded the page and tucked it into my journal, I felt no need for closure. Only a sense of release. Peace wasn't a destination. It was this. The space between breaths. The knowing that I had not been forgotten. And that I had remembered myself. Some things are only understood in absence. Some voices are only heard in stillness. I didn't leave them money. I left them memory. I didn't leave them instructions. I left them a mirror. And when they looked into it, they didn't just see me. They saw who they had been. And who they still had time to become. For everything I gave them in life, this was what I gave in silence. The path back to themselves. And the knowledge that I was never truly gone. Not really. Just waiting to be remembered.